Something's wrong. Alright guys, here's the plan. I got the gaskets for the transmission. So I was going to pull the transmission and the engine out, get them away from the vehicle, split them, seal them. The problem with that is that once I finish them, I would have to put them back into the vehicle, run all the electrical. I'm going to have to put the battery box back here and then run the electrical to it, run the fuel lines, get it running. And then once I know that it's running and everything on it is good and I've got all the amounts for the electrical welded in, then I need to pull everything back out, move it away so that I can then paint the frame later on. And I don't want to have to pull the engine and transmission twice. So what I decided to do, because all the fluids are still in the engine and transmission, I'm going to run the electrical, run the fuel, get it running. I haven't decided if I'm going to run the brakes and actually have it moving and driving before I disassemble everything and paint it. I'll make that decision later. But for right now, the goal is going to be to get this thing running in this episode. That's my goal. That's what I'd like to do. I have 2.5 days. I think it's doable, but it's only doable if I shut up and start working. So let me get to it. Alright, I've got most of the electrical wired up and I underestimated how bad this sucks. So I've got everything just kind of draped over it, and golly, it is just difficult to fit everything everywhere, and it's all just kind of laying around just so that I can make sure everything plugs in okay. This is the mass airflow sensor. Obviously I'm going to need to extend that to go to the new location. I've got the headlights and turn signals and stuff like that around here. I'm going to relocate the battery. I'm not exactly sure where yet. There's a chance I might do it underneath this seat. I don't want to put it there. What I would like to do is I'd like to put it back here. That's why I put this bar in here, because the battery is obviously heavy. So I wanted to make a tray right here that uses this as a reinforcement, but I'm not 100% sure that I'm going to go with that yet. Right now what I'm working on is trying to get these, see, I've got 4 wires here and 2 wires here. What I'm building is an extension for the throttle positioning switch and the throttle actuator. So I guess this would be the throttle positioning, and then this would be the actual actuator. So there's 2 wires that go in here, and that's this. And then there's 4 that go here for this, but as you can see, they don't quite meet anymore because I had to extend it. So right now I'm going to solder up that connection, and then I can get that plugged in. And the goal is to get this thing running with the wiring, just to verify again that everything's good to go. And then once I do that, then I can actually start to mount it to the roll cage. So I'll probably just do some tabs and zip ties once I've got it all strewn exactly where I want it. That's the plan. It's taking a lot longer than I want, but there's no other way around it. So let me get to soldering those. Alright, let me show you how these are looking now. You see I've got them soldered and heat shrunk, and so those are good to go. Now I have not extended the mass airflow sensor. Where is it? It's right here. And the reason for that is because if you look at this harness, I believe that it continues through towards the computer, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut into the split loom so that I can then pull it out rather than just making it extra long all the way back and forth. So I'm going to do that for the mass airflow sensor. And then next thing I'm working on over here, you see I've got my fuse box. I think this is called a central junction box on this vehicle, and I kind of like it right about there. So what I'm going to do, there's a metal bracket on the bottom, if you see. I'm going to pull that metal bracket off. I'm going to do probably a 1/2 inch square tubing right here to here, and then I will put that on top, and then that way the junction box can click right in there. Once I've got the junction box, then I can start the process of figuring out exactly where the wiring is going to go in the front, so I can either do tabs or just figure out where I'm going to zip tie it to these tubes. So that's next. Alright, this is how the central junction box is looking right now. Let's see here. So now I can get access to all the fuses when I just pull the front cover off. I think it came out pretty sharp. Alright, I built a little mount for the computer here. I just welded part of the bracket here, then I added a couple of little brackets to this factory mount here, so you can see how it's working. So that's where the computer will stay. I've got pretty much all of the wiring done except for the mass air sensor. And if you remember, I was going to try to pull it through the split loom by cutting off some of the tape that's on there, but one out of the 6 wires ends up going this direction through the loom. So I am going to have to extend this. So I'll have to extend it about 24 inches so that I can run it across here and have it plug into the side. But that's pretty much it for the electrical. I do have a decent amount that had to get kind of wrapped up, but it's a lot easier to just kind of loop it and zip tie it than it is to, you know, cut through 40 wires and solder each one of those connections. So for the electrical, once the mass air sensor is done, it'll be ready to go, except that I will have to go through the whole thing and make all of the ground connections, because there's a bunch of grounds like you see here that come out of the split loom, and I'll have to make sure everything is grounded. But once I do that, the electrical system should be good to go. Now the next couple of things I have to do is set up the battery. So I am going to have to run the battery. I decided I'm going to try my best to put it back here. So that's where it's going to go. Got to build a little box for it. So build a box for the battery, run the electrical line up to the front, and then I have to run the fuel line. So for the fuel line, what I did was I cut off this. This is like it's like a plastic high pressure line that they run from the factory. I don't know what this is made out of. I think it's nitrile, if I had to guess. But basically, to remove these, if you just use a razor blade and very carefully cut them, you're able to pop them off, and you end up with these barb fittings that you can go ahead and use a regular hose with. So I did it on this line. I cut it, and then I did a small flare on it, so I can then put the hose over it. And then this is the one that goes into the engine, and then of course the fuel filter. I was able to cut it off of both of these. So it's going to run from the tank to a portion of this hose that I had lying around. It's just high pressure 5/16. It'll go from the hose to the fuel filter inlet, the fuel filter outlet, then to the engine. So that's going to be pretty straightforward to do. For the electrical, luckily I had some, I believe it's 2 gauge wire that I had lying around, and I've got 9 feet of it, and it's black, but I'll just have to tape a portion of it with red electrical tape so that I don't get confused. But that's how I'm going to run the positive. So that's good, because that wire is expensive, so that'll save me a little bit. So that's what I'm working on right now. Extend the mass air, battery, and the electrical line for the battery, and then the fuel line, and then it should start. So let's get that done, and we'll go from there. So I had to cut a section of the cabling out. This is the factory, I think it's 4 and then 6 gauge wiring that originally went to the starter solenoid and then to the alternator. And because I'm running a new 2 gauge wire, it ends up being 9 feet of 2 gauge. And so I looked up a little online calculator, and I'm going to lose about 15% of the current through there, which is totally fine. I'm going to be running an 800 cranking amp battery, and so I'll get like 650 at least to the starter solenoid. Now over here, I need to connect these 3 wires together. This one is going to go to the fuse box. You can see it has the factory connection for the fuse box here. This one's to the starter solenoid, where it will get power from the battery, and then this one here is to the alternator. So what I've done, you see I've got them wired up together with just some wire ties, and I've got a little bit of tinning flux on there already. And what I'll do is I'll heat this up, and then I'll add some solder, and then once it's all good, I'll cut these wire ties off, and then I'll throw on a heat shrink tubing to protect it. But I just kind of want to show you guys, that's at least the process that I do for connecting these large gauge wires. This is how it looks right now. It came out pretty good. I normally run a heat shrink over this, but I don't have any heat shrink that's big enough to fit over this fitting here and slide down. So I'll have to pick some of that up, so I'll just do electrical tape for now. Alright, I've got the fuel line all hooked up. Now there were a few different ways that I could have done this, so let me show you how I ended up doing it, and then I can explain why. So the fuel rail's up here. I ended up running it along the top of the transmission over to the transmission cross member, and then along the frame rail to the fuel filter, and then from the fuel filter here it runs up to the metal line, and then the metal line runs into the fuel tank. Now I could have ran it along the frame rail all the way up here, and then I could have ran it along the new tube up to the engine, but I didn't want to get too close to the exhaust. And so the exhaust is really going to heat up this area right around here. So I decided what I would do is I would send it along the cross member, and then I'd ride it up along the transmission here. And I'll do some permanent mounts later. Right now it's just got like some, not zip ties, but they're like fabric fasteners there. And then that way it gives me enough clearance to run my exhaust here without really having to worry too much about heat. All right, so I think I'm ready to start up, but I just want to double check everything. So starting at the back, I've got, this is the fuel pump shutoff switch, so I've got that plugged in. There's a body ground I've got mounted here. I've got the fuel pump driver mounted to the frame. I don't think I missed any grounds. Along the way there's a ground right here. That's mostly for interior stuff like the gauges and whatnot. I have the gauges hooked up right here. And then I have the OBD2 plugged into my computer so I can double check that ahead of time. Everything on the steering column is all hooked up. The key is in the off position, so that should be ready to go. There's a large ground for the front here. I've got that clamped to the frame. And then over here, I have the mass air sensors now hooked up. I have the positive to the junction box. I have a large body ground right here. I have the EGR valve plugged off right there. Of course, the extensions for the throttle positioning and the throttle input, the actuator motor. I have the engine grounded to the frame right here. I have the new positive 2 gauge hooked up to the battery, which is off to the side right now. I've got a good clean ground hooked up for the negative terminal there. And I think it's ready to go. I put the transmission into park, so the gear indicator there on the side of the transmission should allow it to start either from park or neutral. The O2 sensors, neither of them are hooked up. Well, none of the 4 are hooked up. The rears are not going to be hooked up because this is off-road only. The front 2 will be hooked up, but it will be able to run. It just won't run in a closed loop. But I'm not going to have it fired up for very long because this will be obnoxiously loud. I have the vacuum lines that will go to the power booster plugged up, and then the other one is going to stay plugged. That was the one that was for, I think it was the EGR, but it was an emissions component that we're not using. So I think it's good to go. So I'll get the camera set up so you guys can be along for the ride, and then we'll see if she runs. Well, let's do it. Alright, something's wrong. The fuel pump is not kicking on and the starter's not engaging. So, gotta figure that out. Alright, let's see where I was wrong. Alright, I think I may have it figured out. I was looking at, so this isn't actually a central junction box, this is called a battery junction box. This little guy is called the central junction box. So I'm looking at the battery junction box here, and everything is looking fine, except when I get to the starter relay, which is this little guy right here, and it goes into this little spot. I'm getting power in, which is correct, and then I double check the power from the relay to the starter, so this line's good. This is good, and then here this is a positive that actually actuates the relay. So there's a little winding in there that actually throws a little piece of plastic that then makes these two contact each other, and this is activated by a positive and a negative. I double checked the positive here and everything is correct, so it's coming from the ignition switch here, and it's activating. But if you look at this, this is supposed to be a ground, and then if you follow it, it shows that on the police vehicle it's grounded, and then on the non-police interceptors it actually goes to the powertrain control module, where it actually has to make that closed connection to get to the ground. And so I think because I swapped out the computer for the P71 computer, I think that that was one of the differences in the wiring harness, is that that was supposed to be direct grounded for the police interceptor. So I can either swap back the non-P71 computer and the non-P71 mass airflow sensor, but what I'm going to do first is I'm going to bypass it, and I'm going to just ground it out myself in the same way that the police package is supposed to be done. And so it's basically modifying the harness to make it similar to the P71 now that I have the P71 computer and mass airflow sensor. That's my thought. I'm not sure if it'll work or not. You guys will find out when I find out. I'll bypass that with a ground, and then we'll try and start it again. There it is. All right. All right, well, she's running. I'm very excited about that. I was trying to think about why the P71 would have that relay grounded out and the regular Crown Vic and Grand Marquis wouldn't. And the only thing that I can think of is that when they were building these as police vehicles, there were a few steps that they had to take to make them more reliable. And one of the things they did was they removed the RFID from the keys, so there's no chip or anti-theft device in them, which makes them more reliable because you don't have to worry about the key not being sensed by the computer. And I have to think that that's probably the same reason why the PCM gets involved on the civilian Crown Vics, but not on the police interceptor one, to make the police interceptor more reliable. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, because if that's what Ford did, that's what I'm going to do. Now let's go over what needs to be done to get this actually moving and driving on its own power. The first thing I have to do back here is hard mount the fuel tank. It's in exactly where I want it, but I've got to do a couple of little tabs and some bolts for that sucker. The wiring harness still needs to be cleaned up just a little bit. The brakes, if you remember, this box is not fully welded. I was temporarily setting it in here. I am going to have to pull it out, fully weld everything. We know that the mechanism works for it, but it's got to get hard mounted. The master cylinder is hooked up. It's a little bit hard to tell, but there's a couple of lines coming out of it. Those are the factory lines that went into the ABS control module, so I will need to extend those to meet up with the ABS control module in its factory location now that the master cylinder is off to the side. I have to run coolant lines. I do have to do the exhaust, and it's going to be real simple. It's going to be a dual exhaust with a resonator on each side. Tighten down the drive shaft, it's just finger tight right now, and then take the battery, mount it in the back. So that's all doable, relatively quick. I'd like to have all that completed in the next episode. I'm not 100% sure if I'll have the cooling system figured out by then, but I do know that I have the 45-degree elbow for the fuel tank supposed to be arriving today, and so I should be able to hard mount that right here and actually get the clamps tightened down, which will be nice. So that'll be the plan for the next episode, and I guess just stay tuned for that. So thanks for watching. Hey, where are we going?
We're going to the desert so that Papa can practice to jump on the dirt bike. And then we can let Papa jump over the sand dunes.
Sand dunes?
Mm-hmm. At the desert.